And we are here on March 15th for our final session. Really appreciate everybody being with us today. And especially for those that have been able to kind of hang out with us for this whole series, whether that's been in person or following up with the videos. So as we've talked about throughout the series, there's really three main outcomes that we had for the whole series. And that was first to strengthen our district continuous improvement teams and those processes. So that's something that we've been able to really dig into at each of our sessions. Our second main outcome is to build understanding and fluency around the actual the process and the platform. And so like we usually do, we will go through and we'll get a little caught up in the MICIP platform here this morning. And then we have the third piece here is to really emphasize that importance of monitoring and adjusting to actualize continuous improvement. And so we were really able to dig into that in our last session, and we had some good feedback on that. As far as our outcomes for today, we are going to have some differentiated options today. So we'll go over all that here in a minute. And all of those were really based off of your feedback that we've collected through the last two sessions. And of course, if you really would like to use this time to work with your teams, then you are also going to have that option. So we'll talk all about that here in just a few minutes. And just a reminder to everybody that our dashboard is at this bit link, so bit.ly/22MICIP collab. And that's also the link that Mike has been dropping in the chat for us this morning. And of course, this is what our dashboard looks like, and you're welcome to add it to your drive or make a bookmark of it. Once the series is done, this is going to continue with all of these resources. So you'll always be able to come back to this link to get all the resources that we need. And we have been posting our recorded content. And like I mentioned earlier, we're going to attempt to record all of our breakout sessions for today. Wanted to just make some connections back to our last three sessions. All the way back in session one on February 1st, we really spent some time going over some logistics pieces that day, some background information, and the sorts of things that really need to happen in order for you to be ready to do continuous improvement. And that was a time when we really talked about that MICIP is a tool, and it can't really do all of that work for you. It provides you with a great process to follow throughout. But you really need to make really excellent teams at the building and district level and really understand that whole idea of district-led continuous improvement. And you're going to have to be able to think about what kind of high quality whole child data you want to access to be able to make decisions for your schools. And we also talked about the importance of root cause on that day to identify what is the root cause, or what's the main cause for our challenges or the successes that we're seeing. And that was a way to avoid what we were calling solutionitis that day. And we'll talk a little about this when we get into the platform here in a minute, but really setting those end targets and interim targets connect back to the data, that whole child data that we analyzed. So that was what we talked about at session one. And then session two was all about strategies. And we learned that strategies are those specific actions that the adults are going to take. And we also talked about, hopefully not too much, it seems to come up quite a bit, but it's very important to select a very small number of highly effective strategies. And so we really talked about how can you make sure that you're getting the best strategies in their plan so that you know that the time that you're going to be spent implementing and monitoring those are going to make a difference. And so that's really what we dug into on session two. And then finally, our last session was when we got into implementing, monitoring, and adjusting. And we talked about that these processes are really what makes continuous improvement continuous. And as soon as we start to put something in place, we should really start thinking about how we're going to monitor it. And monitoring is not something that it's June, so I guess it's time to monitor again. It's really something that should be ongoing. We had a lot of great resources from that. We had some great examples from Fruitport that joined us that day. And the last thing we kind of talked about that day is that you can monitor for implementation, and you can also monitor for impact. And so the implementation is, are we doing it? And then the impact is it working? And we looked at in MICIP now, there's tools to be able to monitor for that. And we learned that implementation is really broken up between fidelity, or we talked about that word integrity, scale and reach, and capacity. I just wanted to point out real quick that in our March 1st part of the dashboard, all of those documents that Fruitport shared that day are there. So I know that that day we were able to show them on the screen. And a lot of people were asking to see if they could actually see those documents. Just want to let everybody know that they are available on our dashboard. And then Mike and Hilda and I always take a really close look at the Jamboards. It's kind of our exit tickets, and we kind of pick out a few things that stood out to us that we thought really exemplify the sorts of things that we're talking about. So some of the takeaways from our Jamboard from our last session, someone mentioned, I know now how important it is to not have too many strategies. So when you see what it takes to monitor and what it really takes to dig into this stuff and look at it very closely, I think that it really is kind of emphasizes that importance. Someone else said that there's a great value in building shared understanding of strategy implementation by developing an implementation guide with colleagues. So I really like that this person picked up on that. We talked about strategy implementation guides and really thinking about what does the research say you need to do to put this in place. But then instead of just saying, all right, we're going to just do exactly what the research says, the strategy implementation guide says, what does that look like at our school? And that's the part that you really need to work together on. So when the research says to do this, then what does that look like in our setting at our school, in our district? And doing that with your colleagues is one of the most powerful things that you can do to be sure that you're actualizing this continuous improvement. So I'm really glad that this person picked up on that. And then the last one here, this person said, options to monitor fidelity, principal, teacher, self-observation. Really appreciated Fruitport's example of how they were able to do this and how staff used the data to guide conversations about implementation. And so really what I think this person was getting at is there's lots of ways that you can monitor that you're putting something in place, right? The principal can do walkthroughs. As Fruitport showed, the teachers can do walkthroughs. As Fruitport also showed, you can collect perception data. So that's that self-observation. Am I doing the things that we said we were going to do? So lots of really good stuff. Really appreciate everybody's feedback and thoughts about that last session. All right, so one of the pieces of feedback that we've gotten continuously throughout the whole process is that people really appreciate that we get into the platform each time and kind of just walk through up to the point that we're at right now. So I am going to go ahead and get over into the training site. And just one piece that I want to point out real quick, the directions for how to get into the training site are right here under the general resources. And so all the directions, if you ever want to get into the training site to experiment or try things or see what this whole monitoring piece is about before you actually try to do it in your own goals, the way to get there is right here. So I've gotten feedback on that each time too that says, how do I get into the training site? So it's right here in the general resources. Okay, so here we are in the training site. And I was hoping that I didn't let it sit too long. All right. And I made a sample here called the MICIP Collaboration Series sample. I'm going to just blow this up a little bit so it might be a little easier for everybody to see. So we're just going to kind of walk through this real quick, probably take about 10 minutes to get through the whole process to get everybody caught up on what we've been working on so far. And we have our kind of sample goal that we made this year was a non-academic goal. And we were really digging into social emotional pieces for our sample district. And so knowing that, we want our data set to kind of reflect the kind of goal that we're making. And we had talked about the importance at session one about really thinking about what is that high quality whole child data that you would like to upload. And so here we have some perception data from our families. We have some perception data from our students. We have some process data in our for our tiered fidelity inventory. So that is kind of looking at how we're implementing our MTSS program. We uploaded SRSS data, so student risk screening scale data. So what are some teacher observations and perceptions of student risks? And then we also uploaded some MiFi data. And I just wanted to talk about this MiFi data real quick. A lot of people really like to use MiFi data for whole child data. And the importance that I would put on this is that you are not uploading the entire MiFi report. I don't know if you guys have seen those MiFi reports, but they're like 170 pages long. So if you were to just say, here's our MiFi, and you upload the entire thing, that's probably not going to be very helpful. And so going through and pulling out the very specific sections of the MiFi or whatever other piece you're using, you don't want to upload your whole 150-page NWA reports either, right? You want to find out what was that piece of data that was really interesting to your team and make sure that you're just uploading that. So in this case, we were really interested in their responses on if they're feeling unsafe or very unsafe at school. So, so once you have your data sets uploaded, then we do our data story. And so that's broken up into 4 pieces here. That's where we do our initial data analysis, where we're really summarizing what the data is telling us. We do that initial inventory analysis, where we really dig into what are we really doing right now already about this. And then we identify our gaps. So where are we between what we're doing right now and where we want to be? And then finally, we make a summary here that really gets pulled over into our next step, which is to analyze the root cause. So we talked about that there are really 3 kind of different methods built into the platform to analyze the root cause. And those would be the fishbone tool or the 5 whys. And then you can also do your own. And so there's lots and lots of ways to really dig into root cause. And so we also showed that you can do both. You could do the fishbone to really think about big picture stuff, and then you could zero in using the 5 whys. We have lots of resources in our day 1 part of our dashboard that goes into lots of other things that you can do as well. So in this case, we said that we did a fishbone, and we just kind of dropped a summary of that in there. And actually, I dropped in our 5 whys piece into the fishbone accidentally when I built this out. But yes, there's lots of different ways to analyze the root cause. And the thing that we're really trying to get at here is that we're not asking the wrong question. And so we had talked about some different scenarios when we did this before, where we said, hey, everything started going great after we bought that new curriculum. But if we really dug into it, we also put coaching in at the same time, and it was really the coaching that made the difference. And so that's just kind of an example of that, really wanting to dig into the root cause to see what is at the bottom of the success or the challenges that you're having. From that, we're going to develop a challenge statement, and a challenge statement always comes out in an if-then statement. And so for our challenge statement here, we said, if staff had a better understanding of student social emotional needs, then we can better engage students and improve student outcomes. So those always come in an if-then statement. It really helps to translate what you did in your root cause analysis to your goal, which is the next step. So for our goal, we set our goal out a couple of years. I know a lot of the districts that I work with set 3-year goals. I've worked with some districts that still like to do like a 1-year goal. I always encourage people to think out a couple of years, and you can always use your interim targets to set kind of set benchmarks as you go. So this one is set out for a couple of years, and our goal was that we want to improve student engagement and social emotional outcomes across all subgroups as measured by the MiFi and the school climate survey by June of 24. And we talked about SMART goals. And you can see that we identify in this what the measures are that we're going to, what we want to do, what the measures we're going to use, and by when. And my recommendation is you put the details about your measures down in your end targets. So you notice that I didn't say where we wanted to be with the MiFi and where we wanted to be with the school climate survey. We just said that we wanted to use those to measure those. And that's really, the end targets really help you identify the specifics about that. Otherwise, your goal can become really unmanageable. The way it is right now, it's the sort of thing that people could probably understand. Oh, we're gonna improve student engagement. We want to see our MiFi and our school climate survey improve. That's the sort of thing people can remember. If you start to try to cram every last detail into your goal, I think that you might run into some challenges. And so, so we went and we had gone ahead and set our end targets. And this is where our end targets are going to tie directly to one of those whole child data objects that we put in way back at the very first step. So it's important to make sure when you're putting you're uploading your data that these are things that you're going to want to track and monitor along the way to make sure that you're having the impact that you want. So you can see that we want to increase the percent of students that strongly agree with I like school from 67% to 85%. And so we actually could look and see, this was the original data object that we used, right? I like school. And so so you can see that you can tie that directly back to that data object that we uploaded all the way back in step 1. You can also, so these end targets, I usually make my end targets line up with when my goal ends. You might do something a little bit different, but if I set my goal for a 2-year goal, then I try to think out, where do I want to be in a couple of years for my end targets? Your interim targets can be something that are a little bit closer, so you can kind of help with your monitoring. So if one of our end targets was that we wanted to reduce the percent of students that felt unsafe or very unsafe by 6% at the end, then our interim target might say that we want to see it by the end of 3% by the end of this year, for example. So the interim targets are really those benchmarks along the way to make sure that you're making the progress that you want to make for your goal. All right, so once we had our goal defined and our end targets and interim targets identified, then it was time to pick our strategy. And what we did was we chose the Healthy School Action Tool. And this is really going to help us dig into what our needs are for the school and help to make plans around that. And to help to make sure that this was that high quality strategy that we for sure wanted to invest this time and energy into, we use the hexagon tool to make sure that it was something that we could actually do at this time. And so with the hexagon tool, you can give yourselves ratings in each of these areas. And so you can figure out, was there good evidence for this? Is it usable? Are there good supports behind it? Is it something we really need? Is it a good fit for us? And do we have the capacity to do it? And one of the questions that I always get on this is, well, what score do you need so that we know this is a good strategy? And it's not really about the score, it's about the conversation that your team has when you're selecting this. So you can see that our capacity to put this in place was rated a little bit lower. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. It just means that we need to be cognizant about our capacity, and we might need to write some activities to make sure that we have to build our capacity to be able to put it into place. So there's not like a specific score you're looking for. Nobody's going to come back and say, well, I see that you rated this a 3.2. Don't you think that you should have picked something that was higher? Nobody's going to do that. This is for your team's planning. So you can add multiple strategies. We just added this one strategy. Finally, we get to our defined strategy implementation. And this is the spot where we assign who's going to kind of own this strategy. When does it start and end? For this, I had it end when our goal ended. You can assign it to the schools that it's going to apply to. You might have something that just your high schools are working on, or a strategy that only your elementary schools are working on, or you might have a strategy that only your alternative school is going to work on. So you can assign that strategy to specific buildings, or you can assign it to all of your active buildings. And then we talk about what are we going to do to put this into place. And these are our activities. And if you recall from our conversation last time, those activities kind of fall into 4 categories. What do you need to do to get ready to put that strategy in place? What do you need to do to implement the strategy? What are you going to do to monitor the strategy? And how are you going to evaluate the strategy? So when you're writing activities, you really want to think through those 4 things. What do you need to do to get ready? What do you need to do to implement, to monitor and evaluate? And I really like to label my activities as whatever stage that those are. So you can see that there's a couple of getting ready strategies. We need to establish our team, and we need to do those quarterly administrations of the HSAT. And then what are we going to do to implement it? We're going to complete the core assessment. We're going to complete topic area assessments, and we're going to establish activities based off of those. What are we going to do to monitor it? We're going to follow the HSAT strategy monitoring plan. And then what are we going to do to evaluate? We're going to evaluate the impact via the interim measures. So, so you can see that we want to think through all of those things when we're putting that into place. I see.
Dave, we have a question in the chat. Carrie Ann,
Yep.
Actually, it is a district strategy, the tool that in this particular walkthrough, and then it's assigned whatever building or building levels that are going to implement that. So it is a district strategy, and then it's up to whoever's created that is to assign it to the appropriate grade level or building. Does that answer your question, Carrie Ann?
If you need a clarifier on that, Carrie Ann, just throw it back in the chat. But basically, there's not a button, if this helps maybe, there's not a button that says district-wide. It's just that it's if you want it to be district-wide, you would select all the active schools. So that is activities. There's a spot that you can think about your funding here. And I want to emphasize on this. I've had some questions on this since our last session. That this is 100% for your planning. So this does not pull over into Nexus. It's even when Nexus is fully operational, it's not going to pull over. This is for you to think about overall, how much do we think it's going to cost to put this strategy into place, and how might we want to fund it? And so this is for your team to think about. And it's at the strategy level. So it's not how much is this activity going to cost? How much is this activity going to cost? You know, that's not the way it was. And that's something that's very different from when this was in assist, where we had to think about how much each activity was going to cost. This is really just thinking globally, overall, how much is it going to cost to put this into place? And this is for your own planning. It's really just to start thinking about what are the different ways that we might grade or blend funds. What are different ways that we might think of to spend that? And then you think about the total funding. And down here at the bottom, then you think about how are you going to communicate this out. So in our case, we said that we might do presentations and school board meetings for our staff, school board, and educators. So I see a clarifying question from Carrie Ann. All activities will show up in school level plans for a given strategy assigned to them. Yes, so like, let's say that we said that this was just for the high school.
Okay, yeah, and that just rang.
Let's say that this was just for the high school, then there's a report that you're going to be able to pull at the end that's going to show which different places these are assigned to. So Carrie Ann, if that's still not answering your question, I'll catch you at a break time or something like that. Quick question from Don Beck. I thought clicking Title I Part A is what triggered the pullover in Nexus. No, none of this stuff gets pulled over into Nexus. The things that will eventually show up in Nexus, Don, are all of the strategies you select will show up as a dropdown, and any activities that you put under those strategies will show up as a dropdown. So let's say that we wanted to spend some funds on this implementation activity. Then what we would do is we would, on that line item in Nexus for that budget item, we would select our HSAT strategy and this implementation activity as basically the connector there. But no, none of this stuff down here pulls over to the Nexus at all. Okay, we're almost done with our little walkthrough here. So once we did that, we click update the plan and portfolio. When you click this, it'll say update or add. That's essentially making your plan live. So our plan is this. We now have a plan that's in our portfolio. Up to that point, you don't have a plan for by all intents and purposes. So once you get that plan in, that's when it pulls in, and you can see here's our improved student engagement. There was another goal also that someone else had made. So so that's kind of our walkthrough up to that point. I'm going to end it here. There's just a couple of things that I want to talk about to get into our first breakout sessions. So if there were any questions that didn't get answered, please stick around once we get into our breakouts, and we'll make sure to try to get that addressed. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pause the recording so we can talk about the logistics of our breakouts. All right, so we are here at our strategies, activities, and monitoring breakout session. And I am going to, in our dashboard, there's a link here that says more on strategies, monitoring, and activity. If everybody could open up that link and follow along, this is going to have everything in here that we're going to be using today. So off the recording session, we did our check-in and thought through the needs for the session. And one of the main pieces that kind of came through was that people were really looking for that opportunity just to kind of see that process again and maybe dig into the whole process of making strategy implementation guides, making those activity planning tools, figuring out our monitoring plan, right? So just, I think a lot of people wanted another exposure to that. So we're definitely going to do that. And then quite a few things came up about if they put too many strategies in before, and now that we've learned that we really need to have a smaller amount of strategies, how can we kind of streamline that? Or if somebody moved into a new position and they're trying to understand the MICIP plan that was made by somebody else and trying to think about how can they use these concepts to help move forward with the plan as is. So those are some of the main concepts I think that that came out in the needs for the session. And so we'll definitely get into those. So we're going to spend some time looking over some specific resources and examples. And then hopefully at the end, we have some time for people to do some sharing and roundtable. So we can just hear from people, what have they been doing, what questions they have about that. If there's anybody that's had successes that they'd like to share and maybe show some examples, I would love to see some other examples besides the ones that I'm going to use today. So we'll go ahead and just jump into things. So the first thing that I want to do is if you remember, we talked about strategy implementation guides, activity planning tools, and strategy monitoring guides. So those were kind of the three main resources that we talked about. And I'm going to give everybody reminders about those today. The people that made those were Ben Borkel, who we all know is one of the MICIP leads, and also Lisa Asaro. And I actually asked Lisa if she could run this session because as the creator of those, she has lots of examples and those sorts of things and led lots of teams through that process. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it, but she did share some resources with me that I wanted to pass on to all of you. So the first one we're going to look at here is the strategies, programs, and initiatives document here. And I really appreciated this document because a lot of people, when they look at the strategies that are in the strategy bank, or they're thinking about things that they're going to put into place, and they're like, is this a strategy? And I think that all three of these examples here, strategies, programs, and initiatives, are all things that are appropriate to put into MICIP at the strategy level. So let's kind of talk about each one of these individually. So we'll start with strategy. And here, let me blow this up a little bit. So strategies are instructional practices, right? So there are instructional practices and routines that we're going to use in or about the classroom to influence the student learning. So that's our specific definition for strategy. An example of that would be to provide critical feedback to students that invites them to provide a second response. So that might be a strategy that you would use in MICIP. These other two, I think, are definitely fit into this whole concept of strategy, right? These are the things that adults will do, right? That's what our definition of strategy is. And so another one that we could use for that would be programs. And so these are frameworks or approaches that are tied to a model that we're going to follow. And so you might see things about close and critical reading or ACRI or math talks, right? So there's all these different programs that you can put in. The example that I used today, the HSAT, That's like a program that we would put into place. And then initiatives are also going to kind of fall into this bucket. And so these are processes that we follow. These are a lot of maybe those systemic things that we want to put into place. And so a lot of these types of things are like we want to make a strategy around MTSS. Or we might want to make one around these other examples, data-driven decision-making, or PLCs, right? So these are all things that we're going to see come out at the strategy level. These are all the things that the adults are going to do, that the adults are going to put into place, that then we want to get really detailed about how we're going to put that into place. And so just kind of trying to start broadly to think about what does it mean to be a strategy? And I think that these are all really good examples of things that are going to show up at the strategy level in MICIP. So the next item that's in here on our list is there's a presentation about the strategy implementation guide. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to work through some specific parts of this. We're not going to probably go through every single slide, but there's some really, really, really great stuff in here. I'm going to actually just probably leave it in this preview mode so that I can pop through between the slides that we're going to need. So strategies, just like we've talked about this whole time, this is really what the adults are going to do, what the adults are going to put into place. And so you can see here it addresses systems practices. It's linked to that our goal and our end target. And it's going to address that gap statement. And it's going to address how we're going to close the gap in behavior systems. So if you think back to our example from today, when we talked all the way through that social emotional example and our gap statement, really what we found was that our teachers and staff really weren't making that connection between social emotional learning and academic success. And so the strategy that we ended up selecting, that HSAT strategy, that we were hoping that would help to address that gap by helping people understand that link better. So when you're thinking about your strategy, you should be asking yourself, how is this helping us to address the gap statement? And how is this going to help us close that gap, whether it's a behavior or academics or whatever else your systems gap, whatever it was that was there. So that's really kind of thinking about what's going to do that. And you can think of these examples are all examples that you could use to close those gaps. So we kind of went over the definitions here. One of the things that kind of comes up, and I think that these definitions are really great, and I wanted to give everybody a chance to actually read them. And that's, we hear people use the words research-based and evidence-based. And we're not going to actually watch this video now, but you have access to it. There's a short video that kind of goes into this from Dr. Sally here. We're not going to listen to that right now, but you have access to that to come back to it if you'd like to. But this is a summary of that. And so I'm going to blow this up, and I'm just going to give everybody 1 second to read this summary. So really, when you're seeing things in clearinghouses, these are the sorts of metrics that those clearinghouses are looking for to get them put into those clearinghouses. These are the sorts of things that get them those different ESSA level ratings and those sorts of things. So just kind of wanted to give everybody a second to take a look at that. You can see that all of these different clearinghouses are all things that we talked about in our session number 2 about where you can look for those strategies. So then I really like the way that Lisa talks about this piece about selecting that evidence-based practice. And the first question that you ask is this the right thing to do? And that's where you can go to those clearinghouses. You can look at the evidence behind them. You can see what kind of effect sizes that they've had, those sorts of things. So is it the right thing to do? And then can we do it the right way? And that's where we think come of things like the hexagon tool helps us to figure out, can we actually do this? Do we have the capacity to do this? Is it the right fit for our organization, right? So here's a little more detail about, is it the right thing to do? Does it align with our need? And will it be a good fit with other district school needs and priorities? So a lot of that kind of goes back to, does this address our gap statement? Is it going to help us to close that gap, right? And then the right way, can we do it the right way, right? This comes back to those critical components that we talked about. Can you put this in place? Can you monitor it? And those sorts of pieces. And I mean, I know that we've covered this ad nauseum at this point, but that's why you want to have a really small amount of these things that you're trying to dig into to this level of detail. So then this is just a little flow chart. It's pretty self-explanatory, right? So if you chose that practice, and then you have to answer that question, is it the right thing to do? And hopefully if you've gone through and did your root cause analysis and really dug in, made challenge statements and goal statements, you can answer that question if there's the right thing to do. And then from there, can we do it the right way? And if you can say yes to both of those things, that is when you actually move into the step of actually creating those strategy implementation guides that we've talked about. I'm not going to go over these specific questions, but these are all things that really help us to think of, can we do it the right way? These really help to kind of get at that, to help to answer that question. And what they say here is, if you answer no to any of these questions, then you really need to think about, is this really a strategy that we can try to put into place right now? So one of the things that came up regularly in the chat when we asked what people needed out of this session, one of the things was that maybe they moved into a position and someone else had made the MICIP plan and selected the strategies, and they're not sure if they're the right strategies, was one of the things that came up. Another thing was we selected way too many strategies and we need to figure out how to kind of pare those down. That was a lot of feedback that came in from our chat at the beginning of the session. And so this slide particularly, so slide 12 in this presentation, is really going to help you to examine those without having to necessarily go through the whole hexagon tool and all that kind of stuff for every single one. If you really take each of these strategies and ask, and with a team, ask yourself these questions, this would really help you to kind of see, are you in a place, can we do this in the right way? Right. And if you have some strategies where you can say yes to everything or almost everything, those are the keepers. If you have some strategies that you're hitting a lot of no's, then those might be some of the ones that you save for later or take out of your plan. So I just wanted to pause for those of you that had this need. I wanted to pause to see if this resonates, and then if there's any specific example that maybe you had that you could share, or any specific questions that you have about that. I'm using my teacher wait time.
Dave, it's Don. How are you?
Hey, Don.
So quick question. I think this is fantastic. Great. Lisa, of course, does a great job. You do a great job. I love this presentation. One of the issues that I'm dealing with when I work with my districts, and maybe this will resonate with many folks who are in the room, is talking about best practices, right? That level of confidence in the research is not always there.
Right.
So what works clearinghouse, if you pick things off some of those, that and the other clearinghouses, you feel very confident that, it's got a very high level, right, of the, S or tiers, right? Yep. So you feel very good with those. But districts, oftentimes when they're looking at their needs or where they need to go according to their data, or just their horse sense of what's necessary, they can't always find things off of the clearinghouses. So can you talk for a little bit about what you're seeing or feeling about choosing practices that maybe don't have those high tiers of confidence in the best practices.
Yep. And Don, that's a really, I mean, it's very common. I think, you know, a lot of people will find the things that they need. A lot of people are trying to put systems goals in, like MTSS and, you know, those sorts of things. And but a lot of things that people are coming up with are specific, or they actually kind of want to think about it in a different way. So let me give you an example. One of the districts that I work with, they work really closely with 5D. And so they're really trying to use 5D not as their not just their evaluation program, but their instructional infrastructure, basically. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to make strategies out of the different sections of 5D. So like CEC3, they wanted to take that and they wanted to make that a strategy. So and so what they did was they took each of those specific strategies. I actually have an example that I'll share with you guys here in a minute. They took those and they put those into the strategy bank. And so the good thing about all of those is there is a lot of evidence that supports all of the different strategies out of 5D. And so they were able to look in, and when they made the strategies, they put in the evidence and those sorts of things that went along with each of those strategies. So usually what I try to encourage districts to do, if they want to put something in that's not connected, that's not in one of the clearinghouses or not already in there, is to really think about what evidence exists to show that this was effective. And that evidence isn't always going to come from research. So it'd be great if it could, but they may have had some really effective things that they put in themselves, and they have evidence internally that that was working for them. Then they could go into the strategy bank and they could create their own strategy around that. So I think it all goes back to evidence, Don. And if there's external evidence, that's great. If there's internal evidence, that can be just as valid. And so those are the prompts that I usually use, would be to say, you know, what evidence is there that this is a good strategy to put into place. And a lot of, if they're not sure and they're just kind of making something up, then usually we try to figure out what is it they're trying to get at, and we try to see if maybe there's a strategy that already exists around that. A lot of times I'll see things around attendance. People want to improve attendance, and there's not a lot of attendance stuff in the strategy bank right now. But there's a lot of great things through, like attendance works, you know, so it's like, okay, so what are some of those evidence-based practices that we might be able to get from there? So hopefully that helps to kind of point in the right direction. I think evidence is the right thing to be thinking about in that case. Looks like,
I have more of a comment.
Oh, yeah, go ahead,
versus
Melissa.
a question. When we added strategies that were already implemented in the district, it actually made it harder, because then it caused us to go back and kind of do a reboot of something we're already doing. But then again, it's good to have that reboot, but it was more challenging to put in a strategy we're already doing. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes, because it causes you to think you have to come up with your own answers of, is this a good strategy, right? If it comes from a clearinghouse, then there's going to be evidence, there's going to be research behind it, all those sorts of things. So if you're making your own, then you really need to kind of think through all of those pieces yourself to put that into place. So I at least that's been in my experience. So is what particularly was challenging about it for your team, Melissa?
So for example, one of our goals was a math goal, and our strategy was a curriculum that we're already using, but we had to go back and sort of redefine what that strategy does for us and the activities. But it was hard because we already have that in place. So now our activities become, how are we going to better monitor this strategy?
Yep.
So it just became a looking back and a reboot of those
Yep.
activities.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you had some background knowledge, at least to start to think about what you could improve on. So yeah. Yep.
Right.
Did you happen to use, or have you guys used any of those tools that we've talked about so far, like the monitoring tools and the planning tools and stuff like that?
We're going back to those.
Okay, great. And I will say, even if you selected a strategy out of the strategy bank, you still have to use those tools anyway if you want to do a good job with it. So either way, it's a challenging process for sure.
The critical components and the gold standard, that was eye-opening. And then we can go back and monitor that. So that was helpful to go back.
Yeah, those critical components, and the hard part about it, of course, is getting everybody on the same page.
Yeah.
For sure. All right, thank you, Don and Melissa. Okay, so kind of moving from here, this talks about like when you're writing a strategy statement, there's some specific language that you can use to do that. So if you're making your own, these are some good tips on how to write the verbiage for that. So, it's going to say, the adult will, whether that's teacher or staff, school, however you want to put it, but the adult will blank, implement a program or monitor this or whatever, right? And then describe what you're trying to accomplish. So there's some language around how you can actually set that up. And so there are some examples in here. So literacy coaches will use a common research-based model in all grades to improve students' ability to write. Main idea and supporting detailed sentences. Sorry, some of that got a little messed up on the conversion between PowerPoint and Google presentations. But you can see that these are written in the adult voice, right? So staff will use non-linguistic representation, specifically flow maps, to teach critical thinking skills, right? So they're really written in that adult voice. So then it really gets into, this was all about how to write goals and stuff like that. We're not going to go into that today. And this is a really good checklist here. And this kind of goes back to Don's question about if you're writing your own strategy, what do you want to make sure gets into that? And so if you're writing your own strategy, if you're going into the My Strategy Bank and you're coming over and you're creating a strategy in the My Strategy Bank, when you're down here in the description, these are the sorts of things that you're going to want to make sure that you're able to check off. Okay, so then it gets into the actual strategy implementation guides. So I want to go ahead, and I'm not going to show them in the presentation. We're going to go to some examples of that. So this will be a little bit of a reminder from our session earlier, but this was something that came up pretty regularly in the requests, was to kind of review this stuff. So really what the strategy implementation guide does, I'm going to go ahead and open up the template. What the strategy implementation guide really forces you to do is to think about, if we're going to put the strategy into place, what are those critical components that need to be evident? And this is what Melissa was talking about when they made their own strategy around the math program that they're putting into place. They had to come to an agreement about what those critical components were. And so they had to come in and think about each one of these things. What does it mean to put this math program into place well? And they would have to list that, and then they would have to think about, what does that look like at our school or our district? So that's what the critical component and the gold standard are. The critical component are what does everybody have to do, and then the gold standard is, what does that look like in our context? Sometimes you'll have acceptable variations, but you'll always have unacceptable variations, which means what does it look like when it's not put into place the way that you want it to be put into place? And so this is the part that probably takes the longest, is getting agreement on all these different pieces. So
Hey, Dave.
yes.
Sorry, can I ask a question about that? We flip back to that.
Of course.
Okay, so I just need to think through this, and I'd love your insight. So one of the districts that I help chose for their one of their strategies a guaranteed and viable curriculum, which is a huge piece. Yep. So what we did to break that down was we made their activities kind of, okay, what does that look like? What are the pieces? Like what are the pieces? So what I'm thinking is to do this piece with each of those activities versus the big strategy. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I can, you're right. That's a big That's a big strategy. And so being able to break that down, and it could even be the sort of thing, if you wanted to make a multi-year strategy out of it, that that one of your activities is this year, we are going to identify the critical components. Right.
That's a good idea. Because
You
we
know,
did,
and-
we broke the activities over the strategy is multi-year.
Yep.
But I didn't think about like even putting that piece in, like how we're going to prioritize this and what.
Yeah, so like one of your getting ready activities could literally be that you're going to identify the critical components. So do you guys have this broken out into guaranteed viable curriculum math, guaranteed viable curriculum reading? Like, do you have it? How do you have that kind of broken down?
So it depends on the building. The elementary starting with literacy, and then their secondary building is doing it for each of their content.
Okay. Yeah. So so basically, if your strategy was guaranteed and viable, then I would think that some of the critical components would be, you know, things like that there's a mechanism by which all of this can be recorded. You know, there are teams, there's a team or a teaming process for people to make the decisions around this, right? Those are the critical components. And then with your activities, you can really, you know, you can get down into the nitty gritty. I'm sure there's other critical components, but mine would be, are there teams making the decisions about this, and do they have a place to write it down? To me, those are the
Right.
first two that like jump into my head. So
Right.
those would be like critical components. And then you can really get into detail about that in your activities.
Okay, thanks.
And I would just add that there's no necessarily one right way to write that. You know, that would be one suggestion. So there's lots of ways that you could break it down. You could, you know, you could have strategy, you could have a strategy for reading, a strategy for math, a strategy. You could do it that way. You could make one overall strategy and you address that in the activities. So it just really, it depends on your context. And the most important thing is to make sure that a team is talking about it so they understand it, and that you write it down, whether it's in these in this format or some other format. So I'll show you in a minute that there's people, you don't have to use this format even. I have an example that I'll show in a minute of somebody that chose a different format.
Thanks.
Yep. So the example that we used earlier was around HSAT. And so this was an example that came out of, I've showed this example before, but you can see that for that HSAT, we identified three critical components, and that we needed inclusive building level teams, that we need to complete the assessment responsibilities, and that we need to meet at least quarterly to plan, implement, and monitor. So those were kind of the three main things that we identified for this strategy. I want to direct everybody back, if you want to see some really good real live examples of this, to Fruitport's examples that they shared. And I want to open up the elementary strategy guide that was done. And this was around, if you remember, this building was doing strategies around, they were implementing a new reading curriculum, and they had a different curriculum between K2 and 3-5. And so they got really, really detailed about the critical components, right? So for their K2 building, they had, there were daily routines to put into place. They got into the details about what parts of the workbooks they're going to use. They got into details about what they're going to do for the story of the week, the vocabulary, what they were going to do around writing. And then they had a bunch of optional activities that teachers could then put in. And so they helped to define what that looked like. And then finally, they agreed on what assessments out of the resource they were going to give. So they got really detailed. This is what's going to happen at K through 2. And then they got really detailed about 3 through 5. How is that different with this different resource that they use at 3-5? So they use Super Kids at K2 in my view at 3-5. And so then they got in and they did the same sort of thing. What are we doing for the essential question? What are we doing for vocabulary? What are we doing for the weekly text? How are we going to assess this? And so they got real detailed about this. And I know from working with that principal and that team that all of this stuff was, they went through all the heartache that Melissa talked about earlier. It was really hard for them to decide what these critical components were, because if you're implementing a curricular resource, you know that there's this much and you only have this much time. So you have to narrow it down to what are those critical things that we all agree on that we're all going to do. And so this was, I just think, is a really great example of like the level of detail that you need to get at to make sure that everybody's on the same page so that you know what you're looking for when it's time to come and monitor this. So just to show where that was again, this is under on our dashboard under the March 1st resources, and then it's under the documents from Fruitport. And the video link to that is right here. It links right to the spot where they start talking. So really, when it comes to that strategy implementation guide, that's kind of the main stuff that I wanted to cover with it, is really just saying, what are those critical components, what has to happen, and then what does it look like in our context is the gold standard. And then from there, you might have some acceptable variations, or you may not. So you saw that on that Fruitport example. Sometimes there were, and sometimes there weren't. This part is probably the hardest part of the whole process, is just getting everybody to agree that this is what we want to put into place. It's probably the hardest part of the process. I wanted to point out that there's a guide that kind of walks you through this whole piece step by step. And it really gets into, we're not going to go over it, but if you're like, how do I do this with a team? How long, like, are there some supports on how to do this with a team? This gives you specific steps and how to go through all of that and how to do the strategy implementation guide and the activity planning tool. And it even has materials that you can put out on tables. So like you might have a table that's looking at the readiness of something. You might have a table that's looking at how you're going to implement it, right? So there's like cards to put on tables. There's little table tents to put up. So there's all kinds of stuff. You'll need to download it as a Word document. Don't try to print it from Google Sheets. You'll have to download it as a Word document. And then if you wanted to use these, you can print them. They'll look all nice and tidy. But these were all things that Lisa created that she's used with teams over and over. And so she shared these with me to make sure to share with the group. So if you need help kind of going through that process of how do you have these conversations, how can you organize people around this, then this deconstructing a strategy, directions and materials is for you. So I want to just pause there for just 1 second before I move on to the activities to see if there was anything else that anybody wanted to talk about with the strategy selection or the strategy implementation guides. All right, hearing none, I'll go ahead and move on to the activity planning tool. So there's just a little separate presentation that's just about the activity planning tool. And if you're planning to do this with a team, both of these presentations are really great resources that you're welcome to use with your teams to help them understand this process as well. So with the activity planning tool, we're really getting into those 4 pieces that we talked about when we did our walkthrough in the MICIP platform this morning. What is it going to look like to get ready or to install this new, this new piece? And so in Stephanie's example from a minute ago, we said maybe one of the activities is we're going to really take the first year to really just think through what are the critical components. That would be a getting ready activity that we would want to do. There's all kinds of things that you need to do to get ready. You need to think about what kind of teams are we going to form? How often are they going to meet? So there's a lot of things that you can think through to get ready. And then it goes into the implement. So you want to make sure that what you're putting into place is, is that whatever you selected is actually getting put into place. And so that's what those implement ones look like. We'll look at an example here in a minute. And then we get into how are we going to monitor it. Again, that implement monitor piece is where we should be spending the majority of our time when we're thinking about continuous improvement. We need to make sure that we're putting it into place, that we know how to put it into place, that we have all the stuff that we're going to need to do to put it into place, and then we're going to monitor that to make sure that it's actually being done. It'd be a shame to think through, if going back to Fruitport's example, if they put all this work into it and then they never went back and checked to see if it was working. So you don't want to get into that standpoint to say, well, and remember, this is the black box, right? Hey, we bought the new curriculum. So it should just be working now, right? You know, we really need to go back and we need to monitor that these things that we said were critical are being put into place in the way that we said that we wanted to do that. That's what those monitoring activities are all about. And then finally, how are we going to evaluate that it had the impact that we wanted it to have? So that evaluation in MICIP, that's really where your end targets and your interim targets come into place. You don't want to wait to evaluate it to the end of your 3 years, right? That's where those interim targets come into place. So, you know, evaluating it more regularly is going to be really important. So basically, this takes us into the tool that we all looked at before. I'll open that up in here in just a second. Just want to make sure that I covered all the stuff here. This gives you some examples of like language to use this here. So what will the teachers do? What will the coaches do? Again, it's, you know, the adults are going to be the ones that are putting these into place. So you don't really usually need to write activities around what the students are doing. So let's go ahead and open up the template and just kind of talk through that for a second. Template's actually in Word, so you're welcome to turn this into a Google Doc. I think I have Google Doc versions of it on the dashboard. What's pretty great about this is that it gives a lot of really good examples. So let me see if I can zoom in on this a bit. So on this installation or getting ready part, it really gets into, it asks you questions here. How do we ensure we're ready? How do we know that we have the knowledge and skills? And how do we ensure that we have the systems to put this into place? And so if you ask those questions, then it gives some possible, it gives you some examples right below it. So there's a lot of really great information right in this. It's almost like a professional development tool about how to do this, built right into the actual, document. So again, it just goes in through this installation or getting ready stage, what it means to implement, and then what it means to monitor what you're putting into place, and finally, how are you going to evaluate it at the end? So I think we talked through each of those steps, so I'm not going to go into those in any more detail, but what it looks like when it's filled out then is, coming back over here to our example, we had that HSAT example from before. And this is where we really got in and we wrote some examples around this. What did we need to get ready? And so we knew that we need to make meetings with our ISD health consultants so that we could understand how to use this tool. And then we knew that we needed to establish our teams and our monthly meeting schedules. So those are some things that we needed to do to get ready to put this into place. So then when we implemented this, we wanted to make sure that we completed the core assessments every December, that we completed all the topic area assessments every February, and that we then in March, we made sure that we established those activities and we're putting them into place. And then that turns into our monitoring piece, that we're going to follow that monitoring plan that we create in March, that we're going to follow that for the 22-23 school year. And then finally, when we get over to the evaluation portion of it, annually, we're going to make sure that we use the MICIP portfolio to see that we're making the progress on it. We're going to use the core and topic area assessments that are part of this, part of the Healthy School Action Tool to evaluate. And then we're also going to evaluate the fidelity using the strategy monitoring plan. So that's the last thing that we're going to talk about here, is that strategy monitoring plan. So both of these things are just really important to use. The strategy implementation guide and the activity planning tool. This is how you get down into that detail about what it is that is going to be implemented, who's going to do it, what steps are you going to do, what's it going to look like if it's done well. So that's really the kind of the crux of the planning side of it. So again, I wanted to pause just to see if there's anything that anybody wanted to check in about at this step, or if we're ready to move into the monitoring portion of it. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move into monitoring. So there's not a presentation that goes along with this one, other than what was in our dashboard from when we went over this at our last session. But what we have is the strategy monitoring guide here. And this is the plan that we use to make sure that we're actually monitoring all of those critical components. So what we do is we actually take the strategy implementation guide, and you can literally just highlight and copy this. And then you come over and paste it right into, oh, now I lost it. There we go. You literally just paste that into the monitoring plan. And then you go through and you answer all the rest of these questions. How are we going to monitor this? So what are we specifically going to do to monitor this? Who's going to do the monitoring and who's being monitored? How often are we going to do that? And then how are we going to share that? The last one really is how does this connect to the valuation portion? So how are we going to know that this is working? This is going to help us to know that this is that evaluation part. So if you fill this out, you'll be able to have a good handle on your evaluation as well. So in practice, what this looks like is that you get it all filled out. And so this was filled out for that HSET example. Don't worry, we're not going to go over each one of these individually, but you can see, I'll just kind of go over the first line that we said that we were going to have building level teams. And our gold standard was that that there was a building level team that had the building administrator, the health representative, the health educator, and the physical educator at least on it. And so we're going to use school team roster lists to make sure the right people are on there. The curriculum director is going to monitor the team. We're going to make sure that we check this every August to make sure that our teams are set up and ready to do this work. And then those team rosters are available on our shared drive so everybody can see that we put those into place. And so we would go back to evaluate this. We would go back to make sure that those team rosters were created and that it had the correct people on it. So that's one example. I wanted to show a completely different example, and this connects to what Don and I were talking about earlier. So this was made by another district here, and let me just blow this up here. So what they did was, this is a completely different format, but it's basically, it's taking, what they did was they have their goal, they have their end target, they have the strategies that they're using. And so if you remember earlier, I said that I worked with a district that used their the 5D rubrics as their strategies. So you can see that they list out that they're using CEC4 and 5 and PCC2. So if you use 5D, you know what that means. If you don't, sorry. So basically they have their goal and target and their strategy here. And then they put down all the different activities that they're putting in place around the social emotional learning. And what they're doing to do kind of a year-end monitoring and evaluation is each of the buildings then is going to fill out this 4-part questionnaire. So they're going to say, what have we done to implement this strategy? What results are we seeing? What data exists to support the results? And then what adjustments do we want to make going forward? And so then we're going to use this building level reflection that they're doing with their building level teams. We're going to use this reflection to go in and update MICIP. So if we're seeing adjustments that need to be made out of this, we're going to put that in. If they give us new data to support this, we're going to go back in and put in that new data, either in the monitoring section, or we might actually go back to the data story if it's significant enough. So this really kind of helps us fill out that monitoring portion of MICIP. But you'll see that they have this. They have 3 goals in this district. They have a climate and culture goal, and so you can see that they have a few different strategies under that. They have a strategy around social emotional learning, a strategy around student discipline, and a strategy around student attendance. And then, so that's one goal. So one goal, they have 3 strategies. And then they have a goal around positive behavior supports that has one strategy, and a goal around reading and writing that has one strategy. So this district has 3 goals and 5 total strategies that they're working on. And I'll say that it has been challenging for them to monitor all of those to the level that that we've been talking about. And so they've really zeroed in on a couple specific ones with the monitoring tools and things like that. And then they're kind of using this. They're kind of using this strategy to kind of monitor things a little bit more overall. So I guess I wanted to use that example just to say that there's not one specific way to go about doing this, right? We are showing you some specific tools that for sure are going to let you get down to the level of detail to make sure that you've selected the right strategy, that everybody understands it, and that it's being put into place and monitored. These tools help to do that. There are other ways to do that, and I really wanted to show that that this is a way that another district is doing that. And like I mentioned, there was a bunch of those examples from Fruitport as well. So there's one other thing that I kind of wanted to cover, and it's I don't have a resource to share for this. So I think I might try to either make one or make like a supplemental video about this. But one of the things that came up at our last session was I had talked about the fact that that although evaluation is built into MICIP, it's not going to satisfy what you need to do for an on-site review. So I wanted to just check with the group to see if you wanted me to cover that real quick and just kind of give a quick nuts and bolts on it. So, or if you're like, that doesn't apply to me and I don't want to hear that, I'm going to go with the democratic amount of people that vote on this. So if you want to, if you'd like that, say yes. If you don't like it, say no. I'm seeing lots of yeses. I'm seeing lots of yeses. I have one no. Kim, I'm so sorry. So so I think I'm going to go ahead and go through that. Kim, if you want to take a quick break, go for it, or anybody else that this doesn't apply to. So basically, and again, I apologize, I don't have a visual for this, so if we'll just talk through it. The evaluation part of MICIP, you're going to be able to show that you're evaluating maybe this specific strategy that you put into place, right? Because you're going to have those monitoring tools. You're going to have all these walkthroughs to show that you're monitoring it. You're going to be collecting this impact data, right? So there's really no problem from what I would say a continuous improvement standpoint. 100% evaluation is built into the process. The problem comes for when you have an on-site review. And so, as you guys might know, I'm the state and federal programs consultant for our ISD. I worked in state and federal programs for many years as at the building level and building and district level. And so I've gone through my own on-site review where the MDE came into my district and gave me an on-site review. And I've been able to sit through about 11 on-site reviews now in my new role. So I've been through a lot of on-site reviews. And I know that if you were to just say, of course we do, we evaluate all our programs, we do MICIP, you will for sure get a change required. So what they're looking for is that you're actually you're evaluating all of the ways that you're spending your federal dollars. So there's a big difference. In MICIP, you're evaluating your implementation of this strategy. That's very different than evaluating all of the ways that you're spending your federal dollars. So before we had the program evaluation tool, right? If they came in for an on-site review and they said, how are you evaluating all your programs? And you said, here's our PET for where we monitored our Title II coaches. They'd say, thanks, where's all the rest of it? you spent money, 30 different ways. How did you evaluate each one of those? So even if you did the PET before, you still would have gotten a finding. So what they're really looking for is that you are evaluating that the federal funds that you're spending are having the effect that you want them to have. And they're just doing MICIP isn't going to do that. So you need to be able to document that in a different way. And I have an example. If you guys give me a minute, I can find it. I forgot to have that pulled up. So, I guess, does that make sense? Could you guys just give me a thumbs up or like, yes, if you're just understand the concept that the continuous improvement is different than evaluating the ways that you're spending your federal dollars. Okay, so I'm getting a couple positive responses there. And so your on-site review, they'll be happy that you're putting a great strategy in place and you're evaluating as you go, but they need a lot more. They need to know that you're evaluating all the things that you're putting into place. So give me 1 second. I apologize. And let me see if I can find this in the last couple minutes. If and when I do find it, I'm gonna link this as right in this little dashboard that we have here. So give me 1 second to see if I can find this real quick. Hey, what do you know? I found it. Isn't Google amazing? Okay, so let me share my screen again. And I am going to link this in our little dashboard here. So I developed this with a district that has a really complex state and federal program requirements. They get a ton of money, they spend a ton of money. And so basically what we did, and this was approved through their on-site review. So they got a change required with what they were doing. And we made this process as a response to that change required, and it passed it then passed. So this has been something that has been vetted in an on-site review, and it passed. Basically what you do is you just would list out all of the different ways that you're spending your state or federal dollars. Then you can come through to say, is it a product or service? Did it come through a vendor? When was the last time it was evaluated? When did you originally buy it? So you can see that there's just, you can just kind of put in all the details about how you're spending your money. And then it gets into, did we spend this out of Title I? Did we spend it out of Title II? Did we braid and blend funds between Title IV and Title II to do this? And then it kind of gets across to the ways that you evaluated it. Did you do a staff survey? Did you look at staff usage? Did you ask students about it? How much are the students using it? So you just kind of go through and you can track all of this here, and you can actually use this as evidence at an on-site review to show how you're evaluating how you're spending all of your federal dollars. So the main concept here is MICIP is going to take care of evaluating your strategies. If you have an on-site review, you need to show that you're monitoring how you're spending all of your federal dollars. So I hope that is helpful, and I apologize for those that don't deal with state and federal programs, that we spend a little bit of time on that. So it looks like we are going to wrap up in about 8 seconds. So if anybody has any specific questions, you can message me in chat when we get back. Thanks, everybody. All right, I think we are all coming back.
Yep, we're at 127, so it looks like it.
All right. All right, so the group that was just in with me, sorry that ended up being a little bit of a whirlwind at the end, but I know that that last piece was a request that came out from some comments at our last session. So, all right, I just wanted to go over a few, I guess, wrap up type items, and then give everybody just a minute to do some reflection here at the end. So really appreciate everybody's time today, and if you've been with us through the whole series, all the time that you've invested into this. I really hope that you were able to not just leave with some new ideas, but also with being able to move yourself forward on the plan that you've been working on. So again, just really appreciate everybody being here. So this is just a few wrap-up items just to kind of bring us back to some of the main concepts that we covered. And so this is just, this shows us that multiplication problem that we talked about before. Effective practice times effective implementation times that enabling context. That is going to get you to the outcomes that you're looking for, right? So effective practice, we talked about that in session 2. That means that you're making sure that you selected the correct strategy, right? So we talked about the clearinghouses. We talked about using the strategy bank, using that hexagon tool to make sure that the strategies that you're putting in place are those really high value strategies that are going to make the difference for you. So that's that effective practice piece. Then we got into effective implementation, and we talked about that in session 3. And that's to make sure that we put this in place. We took that high value strategy and we put it in place in a way that's going to make a difference for us, right? And so that's when we're implementing, monitoring, and adjusting. And then the last piece of the multiplication problem here is that enabling context. We talked about that really extensively in session 1. And that is where we really get into how do we know that we have the right teams for this? Do we understand this concept of continuous improvement? Do we understand this concept of district-led goal setting? Do we have really high quality whole child data that we're basing these decisions off of, right? So if we have all 3 of those things, then we've created the right environment to make sure that we're going to have the outcomes that we're looking for. Again, this is a multiplication problem, so anything times 0 is 0. So you really have to focus on all 3 of these to make sure that you're going to have the results that you're looking for. So getting into each one of these a little bit, the effective practice, this is where we get in and we really open up that black box. So if you remember, you can't just count on a miracle. We bought the new curriculum, so I guess everything's fixed, right? So you really have to dig in, you have to open up that black box. And so we talked about the hexagon tool to help us do that. We talked about the strategy implementation guides and the activity planning tools. And so those are all things to really make sure that that effective practice is put into place for us. Then we talked about with effective implementation, we have that strategy, the flow chart here that really gets into, did we do it? And then if we did, then how do we know that it's working? If we did not do it, then what kind of hurdles do we have and how are we going to overcome those hurdles? So this was something that we talked about pretty extensively at session 3. And this is where we really got into those monitoring guides, where we talk about how are we going to monitor that we're putting this gold standard that we agreed on into place. And then how are we going to document that we monitored this so that we have this information to come back to when we're evaluating our program. And like we talked about, we really spend the most of our time with our groups, really with our teams that are working on continuous improvement, really should be spent in this implement, monitor, and adjust area. We're definitely going to spend some time assessing our needs. We're definitely going to spend some of our times updating and maintaining and making our plan. But the majority of our work is really, let's make sure we're doing our plan and make sure that we're doing it correctly. And then the last part of the multiplication problem, that enabling context. We had several great resources that were created by the MICIP team around what it means to do district-led continuous improvement, what it looks like to form a team, what are the team functions at the building level, what are the team functions at the district level, how do they collaborate to come together to make continuous improvement happen. So lots of great resources, and all of those resources, of course, are listed in our dashboard. Okay. I know that was a little whirlwind review, so just wanted to kind of put a little closure to all the different things that we looked at through this whole time. So we have about 10 minutes, and at this time, I'd like everybody to make sure that you do 2 things for us for our reflection. The first one is our Jamboard links, and those things are really important to our team to go back and see what were the main takeaways that people took from today. So you're welcome to talk about the overall stuff that we've talked about as a full group. You're welcome to talk about whatever happened in any sessions that you went in. You're welcome to talk about anything that happened with your team, but would just really like to hear about how your day went today and what were your main takeaways. And then also we have an overall feedback survey for the whole series as a whole. And it's not very long at all, but if you could please take a couple of minutes to give us some feedback on it, it not only helps to make sure that we did what we needed to do this year, but also helps us to think about what the series can look like going forward, or what other professional learnings could look like going forward. If you are part of the users group that Hilda and Ben lead, that idea came out of the feedback survey from last year. So we really look at these feedback surveys, and it really helps to kind of guide what professional learning around this looks like in the future. So we'd really appreciate it if you could take a minute to give us that feedback. And those are both linked in our dashboard right here under reflection. The overall series feedback is right here. Like I said, it's very short. And then if you could just go to the Jamboard based off of your last name and make sure that you leave some stuff there. So with that, on behalf of the team, really appreciate everybody's time. It's been amazing to spend time with you today. Thank you to our presenters that came today, Carrie Ann and Dr. Mel, Dr. Terry. Thank you to Lindsay for joining our facilitation team today and popping around to help teams out. And thank you to all of you for being here. It was really a pleasure to work with everybody.
Thanks for being here, everyone. We hope we found the time helpful, and please share your feedback. Dave's right, we do look at it. We really do.